The First Crusade, journeying to retake the Holy Land, Jerusalem. My name is Don Owens, and this is for History 410. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a religious war called the First Crusade. He easily persuaded men to join this cause because Christians were being murdered, enslaved, and losing their Holy Land to Muslims. The Pope offered forgiveness of sins to those that joined and the opportunity to pillage and gain riches. Most of the men did not possess fighting skills, and many were very poor. Over the years, their inexperience would prove fatal in multiple battles, and Mother Nature would wipe out many more, but their sheer numbers and their faith would help carry them to victory. Muslims were actively persecuting Christians, including women and children. After hearing these stories and the Muslim expansion over their lands, Pope Urban II had had enough. On November 27, 1095, at a church council held in the city of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II would publicly preach for the First Crusade. His idea was simple: rally men by promising forgiveness of sins and everlasting life in exchange for fighting and destroying their enemies, riches from pillaging and reclaiming lands, including the Holy Land of Jerusalem. Peter the Hermit would become one of Pope Urban II's most valuable preachers and messengers, even though he was a ragged old man. Peter would travel from town to town on his donkey. He would hold the attention of his audiences by giving energetic and emotional sermons. It is believed that miracles followed Peter on his journeys. Demons were exorcised, sicknesses were healed, and confirmed sinners turned to God. Soon, thousands had joined the Pope's call. Now, there were many troubles that plagued the First Crusades. Some of the men lacked battle experience, and others were too old to fight, especially the men that followed Peter the Hermit. And some had families and struggled with leaving them behind, knowing that they may never see them again. Others were poor and lacked the funds to support themselves during the march. These men would have to rely on pillaging, foraging, and relying on others in order to beat starvation. But despite these shortcomings, men were still motivated to pick up the cross and fight for their Lord, despite having more to overcome than just their inexperience in battle. To lead these men, Pope Urban II selected several knights that were well known and experienced in battle. Several of the main leaders of the First Crusade include the following: Peter the Hermit, Hugh I, Count of Vermandois, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond I of Antioch, and Raymond of Aguilers, who would later become Raymond IV of Toulouse. These men would bring together hundreds of thousands more and would first march to Constantinople, which had been decided to be their first meetup, then finally head to the Holy Land. Peter the Hermit claimed that he had received a letter sent from heaven requesting Christians to turn against the Turks. He was able to convince thousands of ordinary men to join the crusade and fight for his cause. This army that fought in the First Crusade would become known as the People's Crusade. Peter and his followers were the first crusaders to arrive in Constantinople on August 1st, 1096. The Emperor Alexis was looking forward to meeting with Peter after hearing about his sermons. 5 days later, on August 6th, Peter and his followers were granted passage across Bosporus. Shortly after arriving in Turkish lands, Peter returned to Constantinople to discuss strategy. The People's Crusade would split into two competing crusades, one of Germans and Italians, and the other of French descent. Shortly after, the Turks massacred the People's Crusade, first the Germans and Italians, then the French, allowing only those that converted to Islam to go free. The main body of the First Crusade were the four leaders: Hugh, first Count of Vermandois, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Antioch, and Raymond, Count of Toulouse. And they would depart in mid-August 1096 at the request of the Pope. Again, Constantinople would be the meeting place for the various armies that would then combine their forces and march to the Holy Land. Hugh would be the first leader to march into Constantinople in March 1096. When meeting with the Emperor Alexis, he was asked to take an oath to the emperor. The oath was pretty straightforward. The emperor would ferry the soldiers across Bosporus In exchange, any lands that the crusade should capture that had previously belonged to the emperor should immediately be returned. Reluctantly, he would swear his oath to Emperor Alexius. Godfrey of Bouillon would be the next to reach Constantinople on December 23, 1096, and would make the same oath to the emperor, albeit reluctantly. He would also later go on to become the first ruler of Jerusalem. Bohemond of Antioch would be the next leader to arrive at Constantinople in early April of 1097. He previously had been to the city, and the emperor and his people were wary of his return. Bohemond promised the emperor that he was not a threat to his people, and like the crusade leaders before him, Bohemond would take the oath to Emperor Alexius, and was therefore granted passage across Bosporus. Finally, the most wealthy and influential crusade leader, Raymond, Count of Toulouse, and his men arrived in Constantinople on April 21st, 1097. Raymond was aware of the oath, and the other leaders had sworn to the emperor. When asked to do the same, he replied that he had come to serve God and that he would not take another as his lord. In the end, both men compromised. Raymond agreed to respect the emperor and his property, and he agreed to ferry Raymond's men across Bosporus. After leaving Constantinople and heading towards Antioch, the Crusaders' first objective was to take the Turkish capital, which was thought to be a strategic move in the long term. The city proved almost impossible to overtake, as it was along a lake shore and heavily built up. After hearing of the Crusades' advancement and that Peter the Hermit was in attendance, the Sultan Khalid Arslan, who was not in the city at the time, simply brushed them off as his men had easily crushed Peter the Hermit's army. By the time he realized it was way too late, the Sultan Khalid Arslan then negotiated with Alexius for the city's surrender and the life and property of his citizens. This all happened in the middle of the night after the Crusaders had already defeated the Turkish forces on May 21st. The Crusaders were awakened to find the banners of the Byzantine flying over their heads and their vessels in the lake. Although Emperor Alexius would shower the Crusade leaders with gifts, the men felt cheated and were robbed of an opportunity to break their oath to Alexius. Dusting themselves off, the Crusaders departed the city of Nicaea on June 26, 1097, and headed for Antioch, where they would face a grueling summer. Marching towards the Holy Land of Jerusalem across the Asia Minor, where it was incredibly hot, would cause many hardships for the inexperienced soldiers. Food and water would become sparse, and Mother Nature could be cruel. These lands were in the desert, and the harshness of the sun would take its toll on the soldiers. The men thought it was a miracle that they had made it as far as they had. On October 21st, 1097, they finally caught sight of the walls of Antioch. However, due to the immense fortifications of the walls, the towers that protected the city, the Crusaders would not take Antioch for another 8 months. The winter of 1097-1098 was incredibly cold and made acquiring food even more difficult for the 40,000 men. Foraging parties had to travel farther for supplies. Men were dying from starvation and disease. Knights were having to slaughter their horses, while others resorted to cannibalism on the Turkish soldiers that they had captured. Desertion would reach an all-time high, even with Peter the Hermit fleeing. He would later be caught and brought back to camp and be forgiven for his loss of faith, but men would continue to flee. Bohemond knew that the only way to breach the walls of Antioch was to bribe someone into opening the gates in the middle of the night. For some time, Bohemond had patiently been negotiating with the captain of Antioch, and for a price, the captain agreed. On the night of June 3rd, 1098, the gate opened and the Crusaders poured into the city. Antioch would be overtaken within a couple of hours and was now in the hands of the Crusaders. The Crusaders' victory would be short-lived as they learned that the Turkish Sultan Kerboga was en route to take back Antioch. His men would surround the city and wait the Crusaders out as their provisions diminished and starvation set in. Some men would attempt to desert and escape the city only to be captured and tortured to death by the Turks in front of the walls in view of their fellow comrades. Morale was quickly deteriorating and many were hopeless. Peter of Bartholomew shared that he had seen a vision that St. Andrew gave him the location of the lance that pierced the side of Christ and that it was buried in Antioch. Papal legate Ademir of Lippi would remain skeptical because he said that they had seen the lance in Constantinople. The next morning, Peter Bartholomew solemnly led Raymond into a procession of clergy into the Cathedral of St. Peter, where the visionary pointed to the spot where workmen should dig. The men immediately began to dig, and after finding nothing, Peter jumped into the hole and began digging with his bare hands. After a couple of minutes, he joyfully yelled and produced what appeared to be an old lance head. Raymond quickly attached the lance head to a spear pole and paraded it around for everyone to see. It has been argued that Peter placed the lance himself, but regardless, it would give the Crusaders the much-needed boost to their morale and a miracle to believe in, for the men thought it was a sign from Christ that they would be victorious against Kerboga and his troops. On June 28th, the Crusaders opened the gates of Antioch and began their march out to meet Kerboga and his men. The Turkish fighters begged Kerboga to begin their assault, but Kerboga was certain that the Crusaders would be weak amid their lack of food and supplies, and therefore did not possess any real threat, and that his men would easily destroy the Crusaders. This would not be the case as the Crusaders assembled before him. Kerboga quickly realized that he had underestimated the Crusaders' determination and force. Kerboga tried to arrange a truce, but the leaders of the crusade were unforgiving. As the Turkish forces fled, the remainder was soundly defeated and the city of Antioch was safely in Christian hands. But it would be almost a year before they marched to the Holy Land. After the last battle for Antioch, they realized it would be too hot to continue their journey across Syria's scorching desert landscape. Then tensions rose amongst the men as they struggled to find a new ruler for Antioch. It wouldn't be until January of 1099 that Raymond, Count of Toulouse, would agree that Bohemond of Antioch would be the new ruler of Antioch. Raymond would lead the army south into Syria. By May, the Crusaders would reach Fatimid territory where they would replenish their supplies after promising not to pillage the suburbs. And finally, June of 1099, after years of marching and fighting, the Crusaders reached the Holy Land. The Crusaders would reach Jerusalem and begin their siege on June 7, 1099. The battle would be hard fought, with many of the soldiers dying from dehydration and famine. The closest water source, besides a pool at the base of one of the walls surrounding the city, was 6 miles away. Small armies of men from Jerusalem would attack the soldiers as they attempted to fetch water for themselves and their fellow soldiers. Animals were also dying daily from the lack of water. But even though the fighters' morale was at an all-time low, they did not lose their determination to overtake the city. The Crusaders quickly realized that they were in need of additional supplies to make ladders in order to scale the heavily manned walls. They also needed to build siege towers, which were mobile wooden castles whose height exceeded a city's ramparts. Siege towers were used to give soldiers a maneuverable platform in order to rain down arrows and give cover to the men scaling the walls from the ladders. Without these tools, the soldiers knew they would never overtake the city. Then, almost by miracle, 6 Genoese and English vessels carrying building materials sailed into Jaffa. All of the men quickly began building the much-needed ladders, siege castles, and made plans to attack the city. Time was of the essence, as the Crusaders had learned that an Egyptian army was en route to offer assistance to Jerusalem. After 38 days, the Crusaders breached the walls and overtook the enemy. The city of Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders on July 15, 1099. The only survivor was Ifkar, the governor of Jerusalem, and his bodyguards. He secured his surrender and release by paying a treasure for his life and those of his men to Raymond, IV of Toulouse, one of the leaders of the First Crusade. They were then escorted out of the city unharmed. Unfortunately for the rest of the citizens of Jerusalem, their fate was death, and in a bloodthirsty frenzy, the Crusaders would massacre everyone, including women and children. However, there have been later reports that maybe some Muslims and Jews were allowed to pay for their freedom, but in any case, many had lost their lives at the sword of the Crusaders. After the capture of Jerusalem, many crusaders would bring back relics from the Holy Land. This gave physical evidence of the success of the campaign and a direct link between churches and monasteries of Europe to the Holy Land. Pope Urban II would never have the opportunity to lay his eyes on these treasures. Without hearing of the news that the First Crusade was a success, Pope Urban II passed away to illness on July 29, 1099, in Italy. All was not also well with the returning Crusaders. It has been estimated that 3/4 of the Crusaders lost their lives from things such as illness, desertion, battle, and enemy captures. For many that did not return, they returned to nothing at all. For many had nothing to leave behind. The news of Jerusalem's fall traveled far and wide. Most people in Europe celebrated the news, while others in East, including Christians, were horrified by the stories of brutality of the Crusaders. An Iraqi poet captured the pleas for aid from Muslims living in the Holy Land to the caliphs of Baghdad. He wrote of the need of help from fellow Muslims, only to fall on deaf ears, while Muslims and Jews, including women and children, were being slaughtered. How help would trail far behind, or not at all. The First Crusade, called for by Pope II, was a success he never lived to see. By offering forgiveness of sins and riches to those that joined, he brought together thousands of untrained soldiers to carry out his demands in reclaiming the Holy Land. It was not without sacrifice, as many unskilled soldiers were slaughtered in battle and many more were killed by conditions experienced on the road. The victory saw the return of Jerusalem to Christian hands, but the efforts would be felt around the world and lead to more conflicts to follow in the future. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.